Hola, ¿qué tal? Estamos en este programa de Pensadores Contemporáneos y hoy tenemos con nosotros a un invitado muy especial. Su nombre es Stanislas Dehaene. Siempre fallo con la pronunciación. Él es de Francia, es un neurocientífico que actualmente está en la mente de la ciencia, de los neurocientíficos del mundo, porque habla en sus libros, en sus artículos acerca de procesos cognitivos muy importantes que nos importan a todos, como la conciencia, como las matemáticas, como el lenguaje. Entonces vamos a platicar un poco con él acerca de estas cosas y más adelante quizás tengamos la oportunidad de platicar también sobre su relación con la enseñanza en Francia, a quien le piden opinión en el gobierno francés. Entonces es una figura muy importante, es un científico que actualmente tiene muchas publicaciones y que son de gran impacto. Entonces, bienvenido, Stanislas. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
It's a great pleasure for me.
Thanks. So, as a neuroscientist, as I am here in the Institute of Neuroscience in Mexico City, I'm really concerned about these topics of the brain, in particular these that you explain so well in your books, about consciousness, about language, about mathematics. And I have realized that sometimes you start your talks on your books with things about the earlier human beings, with these things that we maybe forgot already, but we used to do, like thinking in numbers, like tools, stuff like that. So how does that relate, the making tools perhaps, with the brain processes that goes to mathematics and so on?
For me, this is the one fascinating question. I call it the question of the singularity of the human brain and the human mind. First of all, it's fantastic that we are in an area where we begin to see bridges between the brain and the mind, and all the way up to consciousness. I think we really can make such bridges. But there is a really interesting question, which is why the human brain in particular is so special. We are the only species who have developed language, who have developed science as well. And by science, I mean the ability to understand the world in a much, much deeper way than other animals. So we're trying in the lab to understand what has changed. And I agree with you, it's a question of tools. We are the tool-using species, but we have to think of a very broad notion of tool. I see the system of writing, for instance, the alphabet, as a special tool, or the system of numbers as a tool. We begin to see how education to these tools is actually literally changing the brain. I have developed this idea of recycling, which is the view that whenever we acquire capacity in the human brain, such as the capacity for reading, we are in fact reorienting or repurposing circuits of the brain that were present for another purpose in our evolution, but were close enough to the final function that we could redirect them. So we redirect a system that is here to recognize objects and faces, and we repurpose it for the purpose of reading, for instance. So in this way, our species, the human species, has acquired a whole variety of new tools that expand our ability to understand the world.
So in this regard, the areas that are comprised in our brain to represent faces, you mean that we also use it for other things like, for example, writing, reading.
Reading especially, yeah. So what we have discovered with several colleagues is that there is a small area of the left hemisphere in the occipitotemporal sulcus which is involved in reading. And in people who don't read, or in illiterate people, this area does something else. It's dedicated to objects and face recognition. But when we learn to read, we specialize this region, and it essentially becomes responsive to strings of letters. And it's this area which allows us to be so quick. When we put our eyes on a written word, we immediately grasp its identity. Well, it's this region which is responsible for that. So when we learn to read, we specialize it for letters, but it means also that the functions of this area have to find space elsewhere. And what we have found is this very interesting competition between learning to read and recognition of faces, such that the face system in people who learn to read, the face system has to move more to the right hemisphere because of reading. Language is usually in the left hemisphere in most people, so faces have to move to the other hemisphere.
So these pattern recognition areas, right, like for faces,
Yes.
for instance, once you start using it by learning for reading, it's like there is no more room for adding more items, and then it has to go to the other hemisphere.
We don't fully understand whether it's really there is no more room, because we also know that these areas can differentiate. And the process of education and learning is a process whereby we start with a highly plastic system, which is diverse and will differentiate further in the course of learning. So one thing we see, for instance, which is quite remarkable as well, is that there will be a differentiation further between the symbols of letters and the symbols of numbers. And in patients, for instance, you may have a lesion that leaves the number system intact, but affects only the letter system.
Yes.
So this is an extreme case of specialization. And in general, we're discovering that there's a lot of specialization in the educated brain, and perhaps more than in the uneducated brain.
Yes, yes. So this is because of the function it's taken. So
Yes, well, these symbols play a very different function. We think it's also because of the connections. So letters connect to the language system,
I see.
numbers connect to the quantity system in the parietal lobe in particular. And because this is a bilateral system, numbers go in both hemispheres, whereas language is much more left lateralized, so we see this visual word form area system, the reading system emerging in the left hemisphere especially.
So I've seen from your studies that the areas that represent numbers or mathematics that goes from to the dorsal pathway, you know, like the versus a ventral pathway that represents the objects themselves or the identity perhaps of the objects. The dorsal pathway in this side of the brain maybe is representing the position sometimes, and these particular areas I've seen is also related to the visual haptic things. So that goes back to my initial question, if maybe perhaps the reason why we make tools is that over there is something related to geometry.
Well, it's a very interesting set of questions, but I think in general we underestimate the level of abstractness of brain circuits. So yes, the dorsal pathway is one that cares a lot about space, certainly, and the positions of objects, but it's also a system that has been called the how system because it cares about how to shape the motor system to use objects, to grasp them, for instance. But I also think that there is more than that, and in fact I've called it the space, time and number system, because it's a system essentially for dealing with quantities. And it's not just, by the way, that space, time and number is my first name, Stan. But it's just a joke. But it's true. So this system deals with continuous quantities, including something as abstract as number. And this has been one of my early contributions, and really I really enjoy this work so much. This idea that we all are born with a number system, and in fact very old in evolution. So we have been able to show not only that humans have intuitions of number, like you look at this scene and you know how many objects there are, how many bottles, 4 bottles there, you can estimate. But in fact this is a very old system, so it's already present in infants. Even infants, now this has been shown by a colleague, infants of a few hours of age. They are just born, they already have a system that tells them approximately how many objects are present in the world. So it's innate. And in fact, it's inherited from our evolution, so we can see that monkeys, but many other animal species have this system. And now in our new studies, we reconstitute this in the other direction, so we ask what happens in professional mathematicians. Well, what we find is that when they do professional mathematics, they still use the same circuit. The circuit has progressively differentiated with education, and now it becomes able to do a sort of generalized concept of number. In the history of mathematics, we apply the term number now to things like complex numbers or real numbers, which are extremely abstract objects. Well, it all started from this foundation in evolution and this process of neuronal recycling, constructing more and more abstract objects out of this foundational system of number and space and time.
Yeah. So you have a study with an Amazon tribe.
Yes.
And I saw another study which is similar, also with another Amazon tribe. So both, I guess, has to do with this numericity in the brain without language itself, right? And I guess this is similar in monkeys. So it comes, as you say, and in babies, you can see. And the mechanism here, sometimes it's hard to talk about the mechanism itself. You have to look at the cells themselves, like firing the neural code. But I guess it has to do with the way the brain itself is selecting information in a broad manner, like for little numbers and then high numbers. Is there some hierarchical processing of numbers which is common to animals, to brains?
So let me clarify a little bit. Yeah. So the work that we did in the Amazon was asking a very specific question, and it's really a question of psychology. It was the question: can you have intuitions of numbers, including large numbers, when you don't have the words to speak about it? So it's not, of course, that these people don't have language. They have a very sophisticated language, but they have not invented counting. So these people have a system of numbers that stops at 5, and they never count. The system is not used for reciting. And so what we showed is that nevertheless, they have exactly the same intuitions of numbers as elsewhere in the world, and as essentially young children who have not yet been educated. But that was pure psychology, so you're completely right. Through such studies we can show that there is a representation of number, but we cannot really tell how it's organized. Now the beauty of it is that the very same behavior, for instance the ability to decide which of two numbers is the larger, or to approximate a given number, or to approximate an addition, could be studied in non-human animals, including the macaque monkey. And this has been not my work, but the work of another researcher, Andreas Nieder. Well, I'm skipping one step. What we did in a human was to create a model, a hypothesis, a rather precise neural network hypothesis about how neurons could organize and have a collective code for number. And we made a very bold hypothesis actually at that time, which is that there should be cells that care about a specific number. So we would find, we predicted, a neuron that cares about the number 3. And it would fire when there are 3 objects. It would fire a bit less when there is 4, a bit less when there is 5. It would have a tuning curve for number. And for many years, actually, I went through different labs because at that time I was not doing any monkey research. And I said, well, you should study this in the monkey, you know. And I was trying to convince my colleagues, and everybody thought this was crazy. How could you study number in the monkey? And then one group did it. It was Earl Miller and Andreas Nieder at MIT. And they found the number neurons, as predicted. They had exactly the properties that we had predicted from the model. This was very pleasing from the point of view of a theorist. Also, the neurons were in the same location that we expected, in the prefrontal cortex, and also in the intraparietal sulcus, exactly where in humans, with our imaging techniques, we found that humans do calculation. So essentially in a monkey, you go and record with an electrode, you find cells that fire, and in this case, they have a tuning curve. Each of them prefers a certain number. And some neurons prefer 1, some neurons prefer 2, some neurons prefer 3. And even the detailed profile of their responses could be explained by this mathematical model. So in this case, it's a good example, I think, of a case where we have a complete bridge from the single neuron to the population of neuron, to the circuit, and to the behavior that we see in humans, going through brain imaging as a way to see the whole circuit at the brain level in humans. And I think more and more we're going to see examples of this kind, where we have a bridge between fundamental neuroscience all the way to the behavior.
Nice. Let me try to link this with the other work you do. So processing numbers requires somehow learning. In the monkeys, you have to train the monkeys to do it. And in humans, somehow, even without language, they have to deal with numerosity, like the fruits they're going to eat or wherever.
You know, in fact, in the monkey, it was shown that you don't have to train them.
Okay.
So
because of the same reason of the food of things.
Exactly. So the cells exist even in the untrained monkeys, and of course even in the wild animals. So we don't know about the cells, but we know that the behavior is there. Okay. A monkey needs to be able to choose the larger of 2 sets of foods, for instance. Okay. It sounds trivial, but if you choose 5 over 3, you are comparing numbers. And the monkeys also need to know how many individuals are around. So the social component is also a strong pressure on the system of number.
So it's like a social thing, like dealing with all this information, perhaps the pressure, the evolutionary pressure for dealing with these things like numbers, but also with words, and also all the information you're learning that goes to the other part, like how are you aware of the things you know versus the things you don't know but you still use, like walking, maybe you are not aware, like or breathing, as your own example.
So
I'm sorry, this is a quantum leap.
No, so you're asking about consciousness now,
Absolutely.
I guess, and about awareness.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. This was the start of the reflection. If we think about consciousness, we have to think about the unconscious part. And there are so many things that our brains do that are unconscious, like the control of breathing. Right now we are speaking, it means that we have to breathe at certain moments. We're not aware of it. It's a very sophisticated system that lets us breathe at exactly the right time. We are controlling our posture. We are moving our eyes. And all of that is completely unconscious. And so my colleagues and I started with this. Because of the problem of consciousness, I think we go step...
It's a tough question,
It's
right?
a tough... It was supposed to be a difficult question. In fact, we found that there are many ways to address it. Because there are many paradigms where you can make an information unconscious, first of all. So, for instance, in my lab, we used a lot of paradigms of masking, where you flash an image on the screen, and if you make it sandwich with another image, before and after, you don't see the flashed image. So it's called a subliminal image. It was publicized by the idea that it was used in advertising. Yeah. It's actually not true. There are many myths about that. But it's true in the lab. You can flash an image like this, and people don't see it, even if they look very carefully at the screen. So now we are in a good situation. We have a stimulus which is unconscious, and we can ask what happens in the brain. And we did many of these experiments to show that, in fact, many successive steps of processing in the brain can occur without consciousness. So, for instance, even a word can be recognized, and even its meaning can be accessed without consciousness. And in a certain sense, this was defining the negative image of what is consciousness. It was saying this is not sufficient to be in the visual cortex for something to be conscious. And it allowed us to clean up a little bit the variety of hypotheses that were made out there. For instance, some people said, well, it's enough that it's in the cortex for information to be conscious. Well, that's not true. It can be very strongly activated, even at abstract levels of the cortex. So people say it's enough to be in associative areas or in semantic areas. Not true. You can have complete semantic activation, the left temporal lobe, without consciousness. So progressively we began to see that consciousness is actually a very small part of the processing of the brain. Most of what the cortex does is unconscious computation.
There is a very large community of psychoanalysts in Paris.
Psychoanalysts, yeah.
You are talking about the conscious and the unconscious.
Yeah.
It's also their territory.
Yeah.
How have they been interested in this type of information?
Well, you should ask them probably. But I think they had some intuitions indeed about the power of the unconscious. In fact, it predates Freud by a wide margin. In my book on consciousness, I do a little bit of the history of the field, and the notion of a highly powerful unconscious processing predates Freud by more than a century. All of the neuropsychological, neurological literature was quite clear that there are many unconscious processes in the brain. So, in a sense, brain imaging has validated this idea, which was already seen in the work that was done on amnesia, for instance, and so on. Yeah, I mean, psychoanalysts, many of them consider that we only confirm what the master has said. But I think that there is a lot more going on, actually, in determining the actual mechanism.
The master said the romantic tradition of the 19th century, which was a widespread notion, the interest in dreams,
yes,
etc.
Absolutely, yeah. So we are slowly building up to more complex phenomena, like you are mentioning. In my lab, I have to say we take a very cautious approach, so we're still doing minimal experiments, and maybe I can explain that now. So the interesting experiment, I think, is one where you have a stimulus that can be unconscious, but with an absolutely minimal change becomes conscious. And in the best case, you have a stimulus which is exactly at the threshold. And so one time it will be perceived, and another time it will not be perceived. And so we reach experiments where we can dissociate the objective stimulus, which is in fact constant, and the subjective phenomena, which is that the subject perceives or does not perceive, which is solely something which occurs inside the person. The person has to report what she is perceiving. So I think we've reached an important stage here. Initially it was thought, and some people claim, that there would never be a science of consciousness because consciousness is a subjective phenomenon. But we find that we can make objective images of the brain when a subjective phenomenon is occurring and when the person reports the subjective phenomenon. And in fact, we did many experiments where we contrast perceived versus non-perceived stimuli, and we found that there is a huge difference at the brain level. It's not a subtle difference, it's a big event. We have called it the ignition. So ignition is this propagation of activation to a large distributed brain circuit, which we claim is a conscious global workspace, a place in the brain where information can be held in mind, in consciousness, and broadcasted to many other processes to be used. So this is in fact perhaps a definition of consciousness, and this would be at the moment my definition, at least of conscious access or conscious perception. We have conscious perception when the information enters the brain, let's say information about this bottle which is in front of me right now, enters my visual cortex, this is not enough. It enters my occipitotemporal system, this is not enough. But if it reaches this global workspace, it can stay there for as long as I need to think about this object, and it can be distributed throughout the brain. This is exactly what we think consciousness is. It's a system for holding the information in mind and being able to use it in a variety of ways. When I am conscious, I think the meaning of this word is that I am able to use the information in all of the variety of ways that are at my disposal. Unconscious is highly specialized. Conscious is flexible, broadcasting, distributed information.
Sounds a little bit like this idea of the holographic brain.
Yes, a little bit, absolutely. Yeah.
The idea that all the information is represented everywhere, except that the signal-to-noise ratio in certain areas is different.
Yeah, no, this is an idea which I think had some influence on my work. But notice that this would be the case only for conscious information. So the conscious information, the idea is that also it is amplified. Yeah, exactly. There is also this idea of amplification, right, and selection. So there is a tight relation between consciousness and attention. Consciousness is the final result of a series of filters of attention. When we look at the scene around us, there are so many objects we could attend. And the brain selects some of them. The selection itself can be unconscious, but the result becomes conscious. And we have only one object in mind at a given moment. This is also another property of consciousness which is important to understand. This is a system which has a limited capacity. So when we attend to one thing, we cannot attend to another. It means that we have to process one object at a time at this level. The brain is a highly parallel system, but at the level of conscious representation, it becomes a highly serial, very slow system. A little bit like a classical computer that does really one step at a time. And there is an interesting connection to Alan Turing. When Turing designed his Turing machine, which is really the model for the serial computer, he was using introspection. So he was looking at his conscious processing. He said, well, how does a conscious mathematician proceed? He does one step at a time on a piece of paper, and that became the Turing machine. But the Turing machine is a good model for conscious computation. It's not a good model for unconscious computation, which is much more parallel and occurs in many places at the same time.
So this is a complex, I'm sorry, this is a complex thing in neuroscience. So let me put this example. I don't know if it works. Like, as you said, there are many items around us, but probably because of saliency or some mechanism in attention, which I don't know what it is, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this. Suddenly the bottle appears into my brain, and then it is connected with a lot of information related to the bottles. So there is a stream of thinking that is going to go that way above all the information that is being represented at the time in all the brain. Like in the brain is active all the time, but this goes above active. So is that the thing like you're saying, I guess, right?
Yes, I think that's very much what we are seeing. So let me give you an example, another type of experiment. So we just are doing experiments in the lab now which go this way, where we present a whole series of pictures, 10 pictures per second, bam, 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 like this, very, very quickly. So you cannot be aware of all of them. What we see is that the visual areas of the brain code for every one of them. And in fact, this is an interesting new development also in brain imaging. We can use the brain activation to decode what is the image that was being presented. So it's a quite fascinating development, I think, that we begin to be able to look at the brain and we can decode what was seen by the person and even what was not seen by the person. That is, I think it's interesting that we have objective access to the brain, objective access. We can, even better than the subject himself, see what was in his mind, right? What was in his unconscious mind. But coming to your question, so if we ask the subject to report one particular image, we see that this image is being amplified. And essentially it goes beyond the first 200 milliseconds. What we see is that the first 200 milliseconds of processing are largely unconscious, and they go for all images, one after the other, very quickly. But after 200 milliseconds, only the events that are selected for conscious access, because we ask you to attend to them, make it into the second stage. And so the claim is also that consciousness is late. It's not super late, 1/5 of a second, but it still is behind the online processing. And I think this is a characteristic feature of consciousness. Consciousness allows you to detach from the external world. You don't have to be online. Sensory systems have to be online. They really react to the current stimulus. But the consciousness is a way to back up and say, well, I want to think more about this. I need a system that allows me to hold on to specific information, keep it in mind. So it's very close to what we call also working memory. And we keep the information in mind in a way which is no longer directly related to what is outside in the world. And eventually these systems become so powerful, in humans in particular. I think it exists in other animals, this conscious workspace. But in humans it becomes so developed that you can do mathematics in your mind for hours without any connection to the external world. This is purely conscious reasoning.
So it would be an adaptive way of thinking backwards of what just happened. So re-evaluating and maybe programming the next step.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think this shows, by the way, that consciousness evolved because it is useful to the organism. Some people say, well, consciousness is an epiphenomenon. I don't think that's true at all. I think there is an architecture of consciousness in the brain because it is useful. It's a useful thing to have. We cannot process everything at once. We have to select, and we need this system to back up and be able to think for a long time about specific aspects of the world. So that's the function, I think, of consciousness.
Yeah.
And it also means that perhaps one day we will have that in machines, because this is a useful function to have in a machine. Select information and be able to dispatch it.
So you think like artificial intelligence is going to happen like in the way, the consciousness way?
That's an interesting speculation. If you look at the current developments in artificial intelligence, most of what is being done concerns unconscious processing. For instance, the systems have become excellent at object recognition. How you recognize a face or an object.
Voices.
Voice. It corresponds very well to what the brain does in the first 1/5 of a second, the first 200 milliseconds. But beyond that, artificial intelligence is not very good. And this begins to correspond almost exactly with what we do consciously. Selecting information, thinking hard about it, going back to the information. So, of course, there are developments as well there, and they are beginning to have more flexible systems that begin to look like consciousness. But I think this is where the most interesting development will be.
So in your theory, there is a parallel processing machines, which are very good for that. But then there is a need of serial processing in order to
Yes, and symbolic
reevaluate.
processing. Yeah.
And symbolic processing.
So I guess this is another thread of thinking, which is
Absolutely.
not fully developed, but and we are coming closer to what is perhaps specifically human. The human brain has a rather specific way of using symbols. We don't need to carry all the weight of the complex representations. We simplify them by giving them a label. So we say elephant, and this completely arbitrary symbol, elephant, becomes a token, very light token that we can manipulate instead of the very big object with all of its properties of visual, auditory, and so on properties. So I think that we have to search in the human brain for a special architecture that compresses the information in the forms of symbols. And this is something now I'm speaking really about work which is not even published, but it's really in the back of my mind, that we're trying to see the brain as a machine that compresses the information to allow you to really distill the most abstract notion of an idea and compresses it in the form of symbols.
A machine of synthesizing information into a small token, which is maybe visual, auditory, tactile, and then it has to be referred in a language manner, or?
Well, the question of language is one of the hardest, I think, precisely because it cannot be studied in animals. That we have to study it at the brain level. So we are making very slow progress, I think, in the question of language. My take on this is that we should consider that there are in fact multiple languages in the mind, in the human mind, and that they need not be reflected in specific words. There is really an internal language for manipulating information. So what I would call language is a system for combining representations, combining symbols together, and in order to represent the information centrally before communication. We have to make a distinction between language and communication. I think there is an inner language whose primary goal and primary function in evolution is to represent the external world and to represent it better by combining tokens. And then in a second step, we can communicate these representations, and language as a communication system evolved because we had this interesting mental representation to share with others.
So it would be the ability of putting together information in a sequence that represents something, like a small story, maybe?
Yes, or even a sort of tree structures that organizes the information. But yes, a story is a very good example. If you are able to think back upon a story, you see it as having a beginning, middle, and end. Each of these is decomposed into subparts. We make sense of the world by using such representations. It's not so clear whether other animals can do this. This is an intense area of research at the moment. I belong to the group of people who believe there is a sharp distinction. Something new appeared in the human brain that allowed us to create quite different types of representations. And perhaps representations with a certain form of universality, a little bit like we speak of a universal Turing machine, which is able to do any computation. I wonder whether there is a sort of universal representation machine in the brain, which, if you look at science, allows us to understand virtually any aspect of the external world. Humans seem to have this capacity for learning about essentially any aspect of the external world and representing properly the information, even including information about things we never evolved for, like quantum mechanics or astrophysics. And so in my new book, I speak a lot about this specific capacity of the human brain to learn information. And I think we probably have evolved quite particular representations and capacities in general to acquire more information from the external world. Learning is much more efficient in our species than it is in any other species, I think, on Earth. we have a curiosity which allows us to attend to new information. And then we have internal language systems that allow us to represent the information better. And this means, I think, that the niche of humans has become quite different. Normally, animals have a niche, right? A geographical niche, a particular way of living. Humans are free from that in a certain sense. We have left Africa, and our niche can be, Iceland, can be the moon, perhaps someday. People are living in outer space now for months at a time. Our only niche, I think, is the learning niche. We are the learning species. We are the species who is able to acquire new information, and that allows us to invade any part of the world and to exploit it, even to the point of overexploitation this day, because we really are able to grasp and put together the information in science. According to these views, science is a sort of characteristic mode of processing of the human brain. And there is, in fact, quite interesting research showing that even babies are a little bit like scientists. Yeah. They do a sort of minimal science.
They test.
They experiment.
Information. Yeah. Well, that's amazing. Like, I guess it would take us to the other part, like these learning processes, all these mysteries that there are to learn, to solve about the way the brain makes the reality, and how it influences our lives, daily lives. How to take this to society as a scientist. That's another part, I guess.
How does culture land colonize the human brain? What you call cultural transmission of cortical maps, cortical modification,
cortical recycling. I've used this term.
Cortical recycling of cortical maps. What happened with the areas that is newly colonized by mathematics or by language? Are we changing the idea? In some of your books, you had the idea that we recognize letters because as primates, we were very good at recognizing little branches. And why the lateralization of the brain? Why one-to-one and why the symmetry breaking? As a mathematician, I am sure you have reflected a lot on that.
Yeah, well, you're asking wonderful questions, but I don't think we have all the answers right now. So one idea first is that the human brain managed to obtain more specialization by subdividing into a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. It's not full, so people have a caricature, I think, in the general public of right and left hemisphere. It's not as simple. But it's true that there is more specialization in the human brain than in other species. And we're beginning to understand that this is an evolutionary property of the human brain, an inherited property. My wife Ghislaine has discovered actually that there is an asymmetry in the superior temporal sulcus, which is already present before birth. And it's clearly as of the genetic origin, but it's only present in the human brain, in little babies. It's not present in the chimpanzee, in our closest cousin. It's completely unique to the human brain. So yes, there are unique aspects of the human brain that make it more specialized in a certain sense. But then you were asking about cultural recycling. I don't think we fully understand this. We understand the initial part. So thanks to a wonderful work that's been done in the macaque monkey, we understand that there are neurons in the occipitotemporal cortex that specialize for various parts of figures of objects. So they recognize, for instance, the eye region of a face. They recognize the mouth region, and other neurons put that together and recognize the face as a whole. There are neurons that recognize parts of objects, or the contours of objects, for instance, or maybe the T-junction that occurs when you have an object behind another. And my thinking has been that we reuse these neurons to novel uses, for instance, as a recognition of letters. And we have shown indeed that when we acquire reading, we really reuse an area which was doing object recognition and face recognition. But we don't fully know what happens in this area when we do that.
What about mathematics? Why does mathematical knowledge somehow diminish the processing capacity of the face processing area? The face is the geometry of social communication. This I'm very curious about the payoff. I mean, the price we have had to pay for culture.
Yeah.
This idea of evolutionary psychology that we were not made for this, and there is a price we are paying. How can we begin to study that?
It's only a very beginning, and we have to consider that, okay, well, first of all, the cortical surface of the brain is fixed. The number of neurons is essentially fixed. So yes, if we learn something, we may have competition with other pre-existing abilities. But this is perhaps counterbalanced by another important factor, which is the ability to generalize. So when we acquire, for instance, reading, we have shown that the visual system benefits because we have finer discrimination in all domains of vision, actually. So we always have to consider the competition, but also the benefits. And I think in general, the benefits of culture are dominant over the effects of competition. But I can give you a concrete example that we found. This is at least one place where we really understand something that we lose a little bit when we learn to read. This is the case of mirror image generalization. It's actually quite remarkable. So first of all, many parents have noticed that their children make mirror errors. They want to write their name, but instead of writing, let's say, Barbara from left to right, they write it from right to left. And they read it and they say, well, there's no problem, I wrote my name, right? They don't notice that it's a mirror image. So we've analyzed this phenomenon and we found that it relates to our evolution. In fact, I've called it the panda's thumb of the brain because it's a little bit like a relic of our evolution. It turns out that every primate has this capacity to recognize mirror images. If I show you this and I show you this, you recognize the same hand. If I see this profile and this profile, you recognize the same person. It's part of our endowment, our evolutionary inheritance of the left and right ventral visual systems. So the child who learns to read starts with such a system and applies it to letters. And for a while, does not understand even that there is a difference between a P and a Q, or B and a D. It's the same thing for the visual system. And this is a case where we have to unlearn when we learn to read. We unlearn that B and D are the same object. We have to treat them as different objects. So what my work has shown is that when we learn to read, we lose a little bit of this ability to generalize by mirror image. We gain, of course, a lot because we gain the ability to discriminate. And illiterate people don't, they always say it's the same, B and D, it's the same. So we gain an ability to discriminate, but we lose a little bit the capacity to generalize across points of view, which was, of course, very useful in evolution. The loss is minimal, it's very small, it's hard to measure in the laboratory. The gain is huge. So I think we can see that culture in general leads to an expansion of the capacity of the brain, but yes, there may be a little bit of a cost.
I know you are an important consultant to the Ministry of Education of France in trying to apply this knowledge of mathematics and language to grammar school. There are 25 million children in Mexico in grammar school. So this idea of the speed of transmission of information from your and other laboratories to the classroom, how is that going? What advice would you give to ministers of education in other places about how to go about making education an experimental science?
It's an interesting challenge. So, as you mentioned, less than a year ago, I was asked to be the president of a scientific council for education that thinks about these issues. The thinking is that we have a lot of knowledge that may already be applied at least to primary school, to basic issues such as learning to read or learning to calculate, maybe learning of geometry. But also, I think we begin to have enough general principles of learning that may be applied to any student. So we're thinking about these issues and helping the system organize better principles for learning to read, for instance. What advice can I give? Well, there are some important discoveries about the way memory works. For instance, it's been known in psychology. By the way, this is mostly about psychology. not so much about neuroscience, but psychology speaking to education. But we know, for instance, that rehearsal is extremely important, and distributing the learning across several days is important. So this is the first piece of advice. Distribute the learning, include rehearsal every day, and tell that to the parents, because it's not just the school, but it's also the parents in the other days of the week.
What about the timing? Every day, for example?
Yes. Well, an important finding has been that there is consolidation during the night. Personally, I think this is a very important discovery from neuroscience, that neurons repeat during the night what happened during the day before or the preceding few days. And what is remarkable is that this rehearsal is completely unconscious most of the time. Maybe sometimes it leads to dreams, but it's also largely unconscious. And it's faster than life. Something that took you several tenths of seconds to experience during the day may take as little as a few hundreds of milliseconds, less than 1 second, to replay during the night. So the neurons fire extremely quickly during the night. So use that for learning. This is part of the learning process. We think we're sleeping, we think the brain is not active. It's super active, and it is an important component of the learning process. So schools and parents can use that, and the individual learner, by rehearsing just before going to sleep, for instance, you maximize the chances of this replay consolidating the learning during the night. There are many other aspects that I describe in my new book on learning. So one of them is attention. You want to maximize the attention of the child. Maximizing attention is the only way to maximize the learning, actually. So this is simple advice that I think we can give to teachers. I strongly believe that teachers must have a stronger training in some aspects of cognitive science that are pertinent for their domain. And the last thing that I want to say about this aspect of education is that we are far from knowing everything. It's a bridge. It's one more bridge from what we know about the brain to cognitive science, from cognitive science to education. So what we need to do is we need to experiment. We cannot just say we know how it works, we know how schools should be organized, but one important idea I think that scientists have to bring to education is let's do experimentation together. Let's see what works. Let's check simply also whether what you are doing right now is really the best way, is what works the best. So we're going to help you measure how kids are doing. I think cognitive science has very good tools. For instance, in the case of learning to read, we already know how to measure progress in learning to read. And we are going to do experiments together to see whether this way of teaching is better than this way of teaching. And we are going to select progressively the best methods. I think this is a very important contribution that cognitive science could be making to education. It's a little bit the same relation. Education should lean on cognitive science in very much the same way that medicine is leaning on biology as a foundation. I think eventually we'll have the same sort of relationship between these disciplines.
Education should be based on cognitive psychology.
Education is an extension of cognitive psychology. It's making use of this incredible talent of the human brain for plasticity and for learning.
Yeah, I guess it's an integral problem, like how to make a kid to learn. It takes experimentation to check on if the problem was okay, it was applied okay, if the kid had a good night, it was a good meal, everything. And I want to go back to the homeostasis. Well, I want to introduce the term homeostasis, and maybe the way the brain looks at the body, and how that relates to information processing in the brain. I don't know if you can tell us something.
Well, I'm not sure where you're going to essentially, but we can mention that, yes, I mean, learning as a material foundation, obviously.
Yeah, what I mean is like, as a whole, the brain and the body, the mechanism of sensing, the processes, the physiological processes, and emotions also, how all this goes together with your theories about the mind, about learning, about...
Yeah. Well, what can I say? I think that emotions are a very important part of cognition. In fact, I would argue that in cognitive science we no longer make a strong distinction between cognition and emotion. Emotion is an integral part of the computations which are being made by the brain. Emotions are intelligent. There is a very precise role for every emotion. They evolved for a particular purpose and they help us learn in particular, or they prevent us from learning. So the emotion of fear and the associated stress actually diminish some of the learning. But the emotion of curiosity and emotions such as humor have been argued to be emotions that enhance the learning process because they specifically target moments where we can learn something. There is a very interesting book by the philosopher Dan Dennett recently, one of my favorite philosophers,
Mine too.
by the way. And he tries to explain humor as an emotion which he calls an epistemic emotion, an emotion that is there because we are the learning species. We need to attend to moments where we need to revise our internal models of the world. And humor would be exactly that. It's a moment where collectively, because it's contagious, we realize that there's something wrong in our understanding. There's something, it's completely different from what I thought. So I need to attend to that, and this emotion forces me to attend to that and to revise my internal models. But we could speak about many other emotions. They are all there to prepare us to specific situations that were useful in our evolution. So they are computations. There is a computation of fear, for instance, which is extremely efficient, completely unconscious at the beginning. We detect situations that should make us attend and be fearful because there could be a danger. So, for instance, a snake. There's completely unconscious processing of images that leads the amygdala, a small nucleus of the brain, to decide that maybe this is a dangerous stimulus. And unconsciously we trigger this reaction of attending, of preparing the body, sending blood to the appropriate organs of the body in order to prepare for flight or fight. And all of that is essentially an extremely intelligent computation encapsulated in an unconscious module. So I wouldn't want to oppose emotion and cognition. And in general, yes, you're completely right. We learn, we process information with a system which is deeply embodied. We should never forget, for instance, when we speak about education, I always tell that to the teachers, we never forget that there is an important need for nutrition, embodied in the fact that every learning episode is one of actual physical building of synapses in the brain. So it is estimated that in a young child, it's as many as 1 to 3 million synapses per second that are being changed, either deleted or created. Right?
It's a dynamic brain.
It takes a lot of energy, and the brain of the child requires a lot more energy than the brain of an adult. Even in an adult, it's already a very significant fraction, in the order of 20% of the energy of the body, which is consumed by the brain. So nutrition is a key component of the brain and learning, and there are cases where abnormalities in learning are directly due to malnutrition. Insufficient or malnutrition.
What do you think of this relationship between music, language, and mathematics?
We don't know. I don't think we know. We are not sure even if there is such a relation. So it's true that mathematicians often like music or practice music. In the converse direction, it's not so much the case. Whether musicians are mathematicians, I know some cases of people who are really not at all mathematically oriented. So it's an open question at the moment.
Well, is there a possibility that musical training of children or maybe dancing or some artistic type of activity might have an impact a few years later on the circuits you so elegantly study about language and mathematics?
It's quite possible. It's discussed at the moment. So there seems to be a little bit of overlap between the circuits for music and the circuits for language. And music is, of course, a sort of language, but a language with quite different grammar still than the grammar that we use in normal language. Mathematics is yet another language, and there may again be a little bit of overlap, but not too much. But I'm struck, for instance, that when you learn music, you teach children about the powers of two, for instance. It's crucial to musical notation, right? And you do that in a very concrete manner by explaining the duration of notes goes by powers of two. So children may have experience of mathematics in a more concrete manner and also at an earlier age when they learn music. In general, there are huge benefits to learning music and the practice of a musical instrument in the brain. And so if parents listen to this show, they might be told really that it's extremely important for their children to do music. It's really a huge benefit for the brain.
I learned a lot about the humanities and brain sciences going to Jean-Pierre Changot's seminar at the Collège de France. Do you see some future in this trying to link so-called neurohumanities, trying to link painting and music and dancing and so on? I understand you're a surfer, no?
Windsurfer a little bit, yeah.
How do you envision your motor cortex? Let's finish.
But I don't think we know much about that.
What do you think is happening?
No, I don't.
You have no linguistic consciousness when you are surfing?
No, I tend to think of it more as a free flow or something like that. But going to the arts, I think these are wonderful challenges. I think our brain science is not very advanced at the moment. So it would be wonderful, for instance, to understand why a poetic sentence or one of Nabokov's wonderful phrases strikes us as beautiful. Or even in the domain of mathematics, why is there beauty in a mathematical theorem? It sounds like one of these emotions that, appeals to us because the mental construction is going to be useful. So I like the idea that there is also an integration of emotion and cognition there, but the truth is that we don't know very much at the level of the brain about what's going on for such high levels of artistic beauty and culture.
How important is the concept of beauty for you as a mathematician?
Oh, it's super important.
Which is, you have the formulas you consider most elegant or beautiful?
Yes, and I was always attracted to the beauty of mathematics, but also the beauty of science. I think for me the emotional component of doing science is very important. In the lab, you will see that we always laugh a lot. We were talking about humor before. I think it's part of the drive of a scientist, to realize how beautiful it is to be able to build even a small theory of a small aspect of how the brain works. And for me, this is still an extraordinary challenge, which is super motivating.
You have a model on synesthesia. You mentioned Nabokov.
Yeah. He was a synesthete. Yeah, he was
seeing
colors for letters. Yeah.
Have an idea? We are closing now. Yeah. So how the different brain areas can change the code, like Kandinsky that can change the musical code to a visual code?
Well, I think it's deeply related to this idea of recycling. We reuse areas that were serving another purpose. So maybe when we learn letters, we reuse areas that were coding for colors in some of us, and the brain gets a little bit confused. And when it sees letters, it also sees the colors. That's one possible speculation for how synesthesia works. In most of us, it becomes unconscious, but it seems to be that there is a little bit of unconscious synesthesia as well. So we have funny associations that are created when our brain recycles itself when learning to read.
Well, there are many things we can still talk about, but the time is done.
Thank you for your very good question.
Thank you very much.
Challenging.
Thank you very much. It's been really interesting. Pues muchas gracias.
Thank you.